You're about to see what 6 years practicing 3D art in Blender looks like, because in 2017 I sculpted this 3D model of Amy Winehouse, and last week I decided to recreate this model with everything that I've learned since. Now I will say up front, because I know I'll get some complaints, that this is not a tutorial, this is an overview of the process. If this was a tutorial it would go on for days, but if you want that tutorial, that full course on how to do this, check the link below. And since they went so quick last time, I'm offering some more 50% off discount codes for the first 20 people, so make sure you're quick. Also, one person that shares this video on social media and tags me in it will be selected at random to receive the course completely for free. Let's get into it. So I'm starting Sculpt a little bit differently from what you might have seen in previous videos by combining old school box modeling techniques with my sculpting tools. Now there's a couple of reasons for approaching it in this way. Now firstly, working with such a low poly mesh gives me a lot of control over the most basic shapes of the head. For example, the brow line at this stage consists of only 3 vertices, so they're very easy to shape as needed before adding resolution as required later. And secondly, while it might seem like a bit of extra work compared to just throwing shapes together, we completely avoid having to retopologise, which in my experience saves time in the long run. Now if you're interested in learning more about this technique, do let me know in the comments. Just don't analyse what I'm doing here too closely, because I was feeling a little bit rusty and I did make a couple of mistakes that I had to come back and fix later, so just bear that in mind if you're analysing what I'm doing here. Now for the ear, I was a little bit lazy and dropped one in that I'd made earlier, and because it's a little bit higher poly, I timed adding it in when the head needed a bit more extra resolution anyway, before bridging the gap. And now we've got a bit more resolution to play with, we can refine the shape a little bit better. Now, as I just mentioned, I was feeling a little bit rusty, and I think the alien you're seeing on the screen testifies to that, but as I'm sure you've heard 1,000 times before, you've got to trust in the process, which I always do, but I can appreciate that it's never fun working through this stage. Now eventually the low resolution started to hinder my progress, so I added a multi-resolution modifier and continued working from there. Now in hindsight, I definitely could have improved that foundational shape a little bit more, but the beauty of the multi-res modifier is that I can always drop down to the low resolution version of the mesh and work with that later. Now right now I'm not too concerned with making it look like Amy Winehouse, I'm just interested in making it look less alien-like. But I do have some key proportions in mind, such as the long nose and the prominent cheeks. But I mean, in my limited experience of finding likeness, I find that you can only get it so far in the first sitting anyway, at least I can. And it's not until I take a break and come back at it with fresh eyes later, do I start seeing the areas that need more work. Since I'm modelling her with her mouth slightly open, I drop in some teeth, and this helps me find the shape of the lips better since the lips wrap around the teeth. I also drop in some pre-made eyelashes and play with them a bit. Amy Winehouse often wore eyeliner with these huge wings, so this gave me an opportunity to sell that idea without having to paint anything on the head. Next I dropped in some pre-made eyebrows and reshaped them to something a little more Winehouse-esque. Now it looks absolutely nothing like Amy Winehouse, but at least it resembles something that looks more like a head now. Now I figured that adding hair would help sell Amy's look, and I started by adding a path curve with a bevel object. Now this was a mistake really that I rectify shortly, because what I should really be doing at this stage is pushing and pulling bigger shapes around to find the silhouette of that hair. And the smaller shapes that are created by these curves can be found later. For the earrings, I added in a torus along with a simple deform modifier. Adding a taper allowed me to create these bottom heavy earrings, though I did just tweak the thickness a little bit with my sculpting brushes. I then continue my pointless quest of adding more hair strands, stopping every now and again to refine the head sculpt a bit more. Rather than start the body completely from scratch, I imported a pre-rigged model that I'd made. Now I got rid of the head and positioned the body roughly as I wanted it to be proportioned. At least that's what I thought I was doing, because a little bit later on I decided that this body was too small and had to faff with it a bit more. Next I added a camera from roughly where I want the final image to be shot from. Now I did this to help me focus on the final silhouette from a really early stage, but do keep in mind that you do want to find a good silhouette from all angles eventually, at least as best as you can. I started working on the pose a bit and I added in a cylinder to approximate a microphone. And I'm not too concerned with what the legs are doing because I know they're not going to be in the frame. Now I start refining the body with my sculpting tools, but I do keep it rigged just in case I want to adjust the pose a little bit later. Now I should say that sculpting on a rigged model isn't really a great workflow, but it's getting the job done in this particular scenario. As promised, I decided the body was too small and made it bigger. Then I move on to wasting even more time on the hair before finally realising that it was a bad idea. So I hid all of the curves and stuck in a sphere, and this shape was going to represent the beehive that Amy famously wore. And she was also often seen wearing a bandana, which I started by adding in a torus and tweaking the geometry. Now I put it roughly in place before adding another sphere to start shaping out the rest of the hair silhouette. Now each time I make a big movement, I just remesh the object to avoid any stretched geometry. I also add a few marks to the hair to indicate movement, and this will just help me inform how I place the curves later. Now here I'm very much focusing on the silhouette in the final shot, but be careful when you're doing this because as soon as you turn the model, it's gonna look a lot different. I then went back to fixing the anatomy on the body. These legs are in the way, so I just got rid of them. Then it was time for a break. Tomorrow I'll come back at it with fresh eyes. Oh dear. Who on earth is that? It's amazing what a break from the screen can do to your vision, so let's make some adjustments. Now, as I said earlier, I did want her mouth open a bit, but it seems as though I've started subconsciously closing it. So to fix this, I select the lower jaw faces in edit mode, and then I place the 3D cursor around where the jaw rotates from. I then set it to rotate around the 3D cursor, and we have an open mouth. That's definitely going to need working on. I adjusted the camera down slightly. I want the angle to be as though it's a picture taken by a spectator at a concert or a gig, so I want it to be a little bit lower. And then carry on working on the base hair. And for that lip piercing, I just added in a low-res sphere and removed the half that we don't need before moving it into position. Now I'd already added like a goldish material to the earring, so I just linked that to the lip stud. Now to start the dress, what I did is I hid the arms and started working on the body as though I was retopologizing it. But rather than create body topology, as you would if you was retopologizing, I just created the dress. And once I'm done, I can add a multi-raise modifier and start adding a few details. I'll come back and improve on this later. Now I carry on working on the model and finding the silhouette of the hair. I also dropped in a ribbon from the asset browser and drop it on top of the bandana, so we've got a bit of a tie going on there. I don't think it looks too bad, but I think I'll play with the shape a little bit later. Now eventually I get to the job which I've admittedly been avoiding, which is to start detailing out the hair. And the reason I've been avoiding it is because this is a long and tedious process. My approach here is to first create some hair strands using curves. I turn the base hair grey to allow me to see what I'm doing with the hair strands. Once I'm happy with the general shape of the curve, what I'm going to do is convert it to geometry and start pushing the hair strands around with my sculpting brushes, as well as refining the edges. All the while I'm consciously roughly conforming to the silhouette that I've already got laid down. Now, as I say, this is quite a long and tedious process and is not my favourite thing to do, if I'm honest. But if you take your time and do it right, the results are usually worth it. Now, normally I would edit the majority of this part out because, as I say, I do find it a bit tedious and boring. But a few people did complain in my last video that I'd done this. So I am going to leave it in, but if you want to skip past this, just jump to the next chapter where we move on from the hair. Now, I'm not quite done with this yet, but after 3 hours of just working on hair, I just want to work on something fun, so it's time to paint the skin. Now, I'm going to use vertex paint in sculpt mode to do this, which you can't use with a multi-res modifier, which obviously this character has. So we need a workaround, and the way you do that is, well, first I've got to give the character UVs. Then once this is done, I can duplicate the model and apply the multi-res modifier and paint on the new high-res model. Then when I'm finished, I can bake this painting down to a texture map and apply the texture map to my previous model that still has the multi-res modifier. Now, it is a bit of a painful workaround, and I do hope that this is something that the dev team can fix in future, but for now, this is the best way I know how to do it. Once it's set up though, we can have a bit of fun. So first I paint on the base skin colour before adding a slightly darker and slightly redder colour to the eye sockets. I add a reddish pink to the cheeks, ears and nose, and then of course the lips. And since the inside of the mouth is visible, I paint that a dark red colour too. I feel as though the colours are a little bit oversaturated now, so I reduce it with a hue saturation node. I then bake the results to the vertex colours and carry on painting. Next, I gently add a dark purple eyeshadow, being careful not to overdo it. Now, I do feel like this is looking pretty nice already, but a roughness map will really bring it to the next level by allowing me to shine up the lips and other areas on the face a little bit better. I then add a bit of noise into the roughness so that it feels a little bit more like skin. Now, I really like how this is coming together now, and for fun I added in a couple of rim lights to see how it looks. Love it. Now, to give this more of an on-stage vibe, I added in a cube around the scene and applied a volumetric shader to it. And what this does is give it that foggy effect so that you can see the light rays shining through it like you might see on a stage. But it also fogged up the character, so I ended up moving the box back a little bit so that it only affected the lights behind the character. I also added a floor and extruded a backdrop from that so that the lights had something to bounce off. Now, I haven't quite found the setup that I'm looking for, but I'll come back to it later. For now, I want to work on that microphone. I add a cube and find the shape of the top of the mic. I then added decimate and wireframe modifiers to create this nice mesh effect. Then I duplicated the object, removed the modifiers, and used the shape to create geometry that wrapped around the top of the mic like so. I then did pretty much the same thing to start creating the base of the mic. And this was just a simple case of extruding geometry and adding in little grooves in accordance to the reference. Now, to make the bottom of the mic ball shaped, I added in a sphere that had the same number of vertices around the object as I had going down the mic. And then I just deleted half of it and then attached it to the mic like this. Now, the mesh is looking a little bit too transparent, so what I did was duplicated that mesh, removed the modifiers so it was more just like, you know, the underlying shape, and then just shrunk it down a little bit so that it sat inside the mesh. And then it was just a case of positioning the mic in place of the proxy mic. Now, the next thing I wanted to tackle was the dress. Now, I'd already sculpted some grooves that go around the dress, but they looked a little bit messy, so I tweaked that on the geometry level instead. Now, in hindsight, these were going to get messy once I started sculpting the wrinkles and folds anyway, so I didn't really need to bother with that, but it didn't really waste much time. And then, as I say, I started just sculpting on some basic wrinkles and folds onto this dress, nothing too crazy, you know, just to give it a little bit more character than what it had. Now, you probably do want to look at a bit of reference while you're doing this. I did have reference on a separate monitor while I was sculpting it, and I'm just sculpting it with the clay build-up brush, and I do switch over to the clay brush, but I'm not too keen on that brush, to be honest. I haven't really got much experience with it. I do like the clay build-up brush better, I think. It's probably less suited to sculpting folds than just the standard clay brush, but it's just what I felt more comfortable with, so I ended up using that more. And it's just a case of laying on some clay, pressing Control to cut in to the dress and just smoothing it out and just going over it until it looks right, essentially. Now, eventually I realised that I hadn't actually painted the body yet because it's a different object to the head, So I moved on to doing that. And the way I went about doing this is again to just get a few references on another screen to see where you might find more red areas on the skin. I tend not to paint too much blue, which you might find on your references when I'm painting a female character, especially a stylized female character. Although I do end up painting a little bit of blue on the fingers in a little bit. And essentially I'm just going around the body adding a little bit of red to key areas. But I'm not too concerned about it because really the focal point is on the head. That's where you want most of your skin texture, most of the detail to be. Now I think this is looking a little bit nicer, a little bit more realistic, but I also think those fingernails could do with a little bit of paint on them. They're looking a bit bare at the minute. So, you know, match up to the eyeshadow and all that. I paint them dark purple. And granted, I'm not a makeup artist by any stretch of the imagination, but it did seem like a good idea. And then I moved on to painting the roughness of the body, and I did make the fingernails a bit shinier than the rest of the body. And again, I'm just using reference on another screen to figure out where to put more or less shininess on the rest of the body. Now eventually I did come back and start playing with these lights in the background to try and get those light rays that I was talking about earlier, because I'm not quite achieving the look that I'm going for yet, but I do get there eventually after, you know, a lot of tweaking. And then eventually I remember that, of course, Amy Winehouse famously has quite a lot of tattoos that I'd almost forgotten to add to this body. So the way I went around doing that is first I googled Amy Winehouse tattoos, and essentially you can buy transfers. I don't know if you ever had these when you were a kid, these little stickers that you essentially put in your arm, put a bit of water on, and then you've got a tattoo that lasts for about, I don't know, 45 minutes before it starts peeling off. Anyway, I found these online, which I figured I would save time by using and just slapping on as tattoos, but didn't really work because in the end I ended up having to refine these tattoos quite a lot. They required quite a bit of overpainting and they weren't as accurate as I would have liked to her original tattoos. But essentially the way I ended up applying these tattoos was, rather than paint over the skin texture, which would have been quite tricky to get it to look right, what I did was just add a plane into the scene and then wrap the plane around the body model using a shrink wrap modifier, and then just tweaking the look of the tattoo using a shader. And after quite a bit of tweaking, it started to look kind of like a tattoo. I think the final result looked pretty decent anyway. They look sort of like tattoos to me. Now at this point I'm pretty much ready to start rendering, but I'm looking at that hair and thinking it just looks a little bit too simple, like it could use a little bit of extra detail. So what I ended up doing was just going about the hair with the hair curves that I laid down earlier and turned into geometry. Well, I did that again, but rather than turn it into geometry, I just left them as hair curves with a little bit of detail. Now I didn't go over the entire head of hair with these, I just added them in a few places so as to not go too crazy with detail, because you can go over detailed with stuff like this, especially with like a character like this one. You don't want to go too crazy with the detail, and essentially just did what I did earlier, just going around the head until I was happy with how it looked, and then finally we were ready to start rendering this thing. So I rendered out a few passes. I rendered out the beauty, the depth, the ambient occlusion, and a couple of masks as well, just so I can fine tune some stuff if I need to. I don't think I actually ended up doing. Brought all the passes into Photoshop, added in a few correctional layers such as a brightness and contrast, a color correction, and just all the little tweaky stuff that you do in Photoshop. I'm sure that's something we can talk about in another video. And finally we ended up with. Now just before we see the final result, you know what I'm going to ask you? If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up and a comment to help out the algorithm. And also if you share it on social media, you'd be doing me a massive favour, and of course you could end up with the course for free if you tag me in it as well. So let's see what 6 years progress looks like.
That I just can't deny.